Welcome to BeFm Drama, where we turn great literature into gripping radio. In today's episode, we're bringing you part 4 in a 5-part adaptation of The Final Problem, one of the most famous Sherlock Holmes stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. In this tale, Holmes has come up against Professor Moriarty, a brilliant mathematician who secretly runs a pervasive and expansive criminal network in London and is indirectly responsible for much of the most serious crime that takes place in the metropolis. Moriarty is every bit as much genius as Sherlock Holmes, and the battle of wits between the detective and the professor has been the fiercest of Sherlock's career. Holmes has finally succeeded in setting a trap, a series of police raids that will see Moriarty's criminal network rolled up and arrested. But Moriarty knows of this plan and has, in desperation, turned his singular genius entirely towards having the great detective killed. Knowing the danger that he is in, Holmes has suggested to his close friend Dr. Watson that they flee together to continental Europe until after Holmes's plan has gone into action and Moriarty and his associates have been arrested. As we rejoin the story in part 4, Holmes and Watson attempt to give their pursuer the slip by abandoning their train before it arrives at port, leaving their luggage on board as a decoy for Moriarty, who is hot on their heels in a hired private train. We left the train at Canterbury, as Holmes had suggested, only to find that we should have to wait an hour before we could get a train to Newhaven. I was still looking rather ruefully after the rapidly disappearing luggage van which contained my wardrobe, when Holmes pulled my sleeve and pointed up the line.
Already, you see.
Far away, from among the Kentish woods, there rose a thin spray of smoke. A minute later, a carriage and engine could be seen flying along the open curve which leads to the station. We had hardly time to take our place behind a pile of luggage when it passed with a rattle and a roar, beating a blast of hot air into our faces.
There he goes. There are limits, you see, to our friend's intelligence. It would have been a miracle if he had been able to deduce what I would deduce and act accordingly.
And what would he have done if he had overtaken us?
There cannot be the least doubt that he would have made a murderous attack upon me. It is, however, a game at which two may play. The question now is whether we should take a premature lunch here or run the risk of starving to death before we reach the buffet at Newhaven.
We made our way to Brussels that night and spent 2 days there, moving on upon the 3rd day as far as Strasbourg. On the Monday morning, Holmes had telegraphed to the London police, and in the evening we found a reply waiting for us at our hotel. Holmes tore it open, and then, with a bitter curse, hurled it into the grate.
I might have known it. He has escaped.
Moriarty?
They have secured the whole gang with the exception of him. He has given them the slip. Of course, when I had left the country, there was no one to cope with him, but I did think that I had put the game in their hands. I think that you had better return to England, Watson.
Why?
Because you will find me a most dangerous companion now. This man's occupation is gone. He is lost if he returns to London. If I read his character right, he will devote his entire energy to revenging himself upon me. He has said as much in our short interview, and I fancy that he meant it. I should certainly recommend you to return to your practice.
It was hardly an appeal to be successful with one who was an old campaigner as well as an old friend. We sat arguing the question for half an hour, but the same night we had resumed our journey and were well on our way to Geneva. For a charming week, we wandered up the valley of the Rhone, and then, branching off at Luc, we made our way over the Gemmi Pass, still deep in snow, and so, by way of Interlaken, to Meiringen. It was a lovely trip, the dainty green of the spring below, the virgin white of the winter above. But it was clear to me that never for one instant did Holmes forget the shadow which lay across him. In the homely alpine villages or in the lonely mountain passes, I could tell by his quick glancing eyes and his sharp scrutiny of every face that passed us that he was well convinced that, walk where we would, we could not walk ourselves clear of the danger which was dogging our footsteps. Once, I remember, as we passed over the Gemmi and walked along the border of the melancholy Dauben Sea, a large rock, which had been dislodged from the ridge upon our right, clattered down and roared into the lake behind us. In an instant, Holmes had raced up to the ridge and, standing upon a lofty pinnacle, craned his neck in every direction. It was in vain that our guide assured him that a fall of stones was a common chance in the springtime in that spot. He said nothing, but he smiled at me with an air of a man who sees the fulfillment of that which he had expected. And yet, for all his watchfulness, he was never depressed. On the contrary, I can never recollect having seen him in such exuberant spirits. Again and again, he restated the fact that if he could be assured that society was freed from Professor Moriarty, he would cheerfully bring his own career to a conclusion.
I think that I may go so far as to say, Watson, that I have not lived wholly in vain. If my record were closed tonight, I could still survey it with happiness. The air of London is the sweeter for my presence. In over 1,000 cases I am not aware that I have ever used my powers upon the wrong side. Of late I have been tempted to look into the problems furnished by nature rather than those more superficial ones for which our artificial state of society is responsible. Your memoirs will draw to a close, Watson, upon the day that I crown my career by the capture or extinction of the most dangerous and capable criminal in Europe.
I shall be brief, and yet exact, in the little which remains for me to tell. It is not a subject on which I would willingly dwell, and yet I am conscious that a duty devolves upon me to omit no detail. It was on the 3rd of May that we reached the little village of Meiringen, where we put up at the Englischerhof, then kept by Peter Steiler the elder. Our landlord was an intelligent man and spoke excellent English, having served for 3 years as waiter at the Grosvenor Hotel in London. At his advice, on the afternoon of the 4th, we set off together with the intention of crossing the hills and spending the night at the hamlet of Rosenlaui. We had strict injunctions, however, on no account to pass the falls of Reichenbach, which are about halfway up the hill, without making a small detour to see them. It is indeed a fearful place. The torrent, swollen by the melting snow, plunges into a tremendous abyss from which the spray rolls up like the smoke from a burning house. The shaft into which the river hurls itself is an immense chasm, lined by glistening coal-black rock and narrowing into a creaming, boiling pit of incalculable depth, which brims over and shoots the stream onward over its jagged lip. The long sweep of green water roaring forever down, and the thick flickering curtain of spray hissing forever upward, turn a man giddy with their constant whirl and clamor. We stood near the edge, peering down at the gleam of the breaking water far below us against the black rocks, and listening to the half-human shout which came booming up with the spray out of the abyss. The path had been cut halfway round the fall to afford a complete view, but it ends abruptly, and the traveler has to return as he came. We had turned to do so when we saw a Swiss lad come running in with a letter in his hand. It bore the mark of the hotel which we had just left, and was addressed to me by the landlord. It appeared that, within very few minutes of our leaving, an English lady had arrived who was in the last stage of consumption. She had wintered at Davos-Platz and was journeying now to join her friends at Lucerne, when a sudden hemorrhage had overtaken her. It was thought that she could hardly live a few hours, but it would be a great consolation to her to see an English doctor, and, if I would only return, etc., the good Steiler assured me in a postscript that he himself would look upon my compliance as a very great favor, since the lady absolutely refused to see a Swiss physician, and he could not but feel he was incurring a great responsibility. And so we approach the end of this story. The work that Holmes has poured into this case over 3 harrowing months of cat and mouse with the brilliant Moriarty has paid off. The criminal mastermind's network has been destroyed, his criminal associates arrested en masse, but the ringleader, Moriarty himself, remains at large. Holmes and Watson are taking shelter in Switzerland, finding safety and solace in the beauty of the Bernese Alps. Watson and Holmes have trekked up to the Reichenbach Falls, famed for their beauty and power, but Watson has been suddenly called away by a medical emergency. But is there really a sick English girl waiting for him at the hotel? And has this matter with Moriarty truly yet been resolved? Find out tomorrow in the final episode of our adaptation of The Final Problem here on BeFm Drama.